19th of May, 1944. Somewhere in the Pacific, southeast of Bougainville, the destroyer escort USS England crept forward at low speed. Her sonar operator hunched over his set, listening for an echo that would mean the difference between a quiet patrol and a kill. She had two sister ships alongside, USS George and USS Ruby, all three dispatched on the strength of decoded Japanese radio traffic. Somewhere ahead, along a scouting line of submarines strung out to catch the next American thrust across the Pacific, lay the Japanese submarine I-16. At 0300 that morning, England's sonar picked up a firm contact. Her executive officer, Lieutenant John A. Williamson, ordered the ship in. What happened next did not look like a depth charge attack. There was no wide, rolling barrage dropped astern, no wait for the target to blunder through a pattern of explosives set to detonate at a guessed depth. Instead, England ran up over the contact and from her foredeck hurled a cluster of 24 small mortar bombs forward and outward in an ellipse, so that they fell ahead of the ship while her sonar still held the submarine in contact. 4 attack runs later, the sea erupted. I-16 was destroyed with all hands. It was the England's first kill of the war, and it was not her last. Over the following 12 days, she would sink 5 more Japanese submarines, one after another, a run of 6 kills that no warship, before or since, has matched. The weapon that did it was not a torpedo, not a gun, not even the depth charge that every escort captain had trained on for years. It was a strange-looking device called the Hedgehog, a spigot mortar that threw 24 small bombs ahead of the ship instead of rolling large ones off the stern. To the men who had spent the war fighting submarines with depth charges, the difference it made was almost incomprehensible. To understand why the Hedgehog worked where the depth charge so often failed, it helps to go back to the specific problem the depth charge could never solve. ASDIC and sonar could hold a submerged submarine in contact only up to a point. As an attacking ship closed the range, the returning echo and the outgoing sound pulse began to merge, and somewhere in the last few hundred yards before the ship passed overhead, contact was lost entirely. This was the blind period. A U-boat commander who knew his business used those final seconds to turn hard and run, so that by the time the depth charges rolled off the stern and sank to their preset depth, the submarine that had been detected minutes earlier was often no longer there. Depth charges also worked by hydrostatic shock, relying on a near miss to crush a hull rather than a direct hit to breach it, which meant even a reasonably close explosion often did nothing more than rattle the crew's nerves. The answer came out of a secretive corner of Britain's Ministry of Supply, the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, credited in most accounts to Major Millis Jeffress, whose department was already responsible for an odd assortment of specialist armaments built to solve problems nobody else had managed to crack. Their solution was to throw the weapon ahead of the ship, rather than drop it behind. A spigot mortar mounted on the foredeck could fling 24 small bombs forward in a calculated pattern, landing in an ellipse roughly 40 meters across, while the ship's sonar kept the target in unbroken contact the entire time. Each bomb weighed about 65 pounds and carried a 35-pound Torpex charge, small compared to a depth charge, but the bombs were fitted with contact fuses rather than time or depth fuses. They would not go off unless they struck something solid. A submarine hull would do. That single design choice, contact detonation instead of a preset depth, changed the entire logic of anti-submarine warfare. A depth charge attack always produced an explosion, whether it hit anything or not, and crews could convince themselves a near miss had done some good even when it had not. A Hedgehog attack that missed produced nothing at all, a discouraging, uneventful splash and silence. But a Hedgehog attack that hit meant only one thing. The enemy submarine had been struck, and struck hard, by an explosive charge going off directly against her pressure hull rather than in the surrounding water. The weapon was first trialled aboard the old destroyer HMS Westcott from 1941, and by the end of 1942 it had been fitted to more than 100 Royal Navy ships. It reached the United States Navy that same year, arriving as a form of reverse lend-lease, and would go on to be built into destroyer escorts purpose-designed for the anti-submarine role. The weapon's early record gave little hint of what it would become. Initial Hedgehog success rates ran at around 5%, barely better than depth charges, and crews grew wary of a system that seemed to produce mostly silence. Rough weather in the North Atlantic frequently soaked the launcher and fouled its firing circuits, so that patterns went off incomplete or not at all. It took a deliberate effort, an officer sent out to Londonderry in Northern Ireland to run shipwide briefings and share accounts of successful attacks, before crews learned to trust the weapon and use it properly. Once they did, the kill rate climbed sharply, eventually settling at around 1 attack in 5, resulting in a kill, a figure confirmed across multiple post-war assessments of the weapon's record. The USS England's 12 days in May 1944 became the clearest demonstration the war would produce of what a well-drilled Hedgehog crew could do. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, newly appointed commander of Japan's combined fleet, had strung a picket line of submarines, among them I-16, RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-116 and RO-117, across the Pacific to give warning of the next American advance. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific decoded the transmissions that gave the line away, and England, George and Raby were sent to roll it up boat by boat. England accounted for 6 of the 7 vessels on that line, working her Hedgehog with a precision her captain, Lieutenant Commander Walton B. Pendleton, and Executive Officer Williamson had spent months drilling into their crew. One of the submarines destroyed, RO-108, went down with 58 men aboard, the muffled blasts of the Hedgehog pattern detonating some 250 feet below the surface. It was, by any measure, one of the most effective anti-submarine patrols of the entire war, achieved not by a fleet destroyer or an aircraft carrier, but by a 1,400-ton escort, a quarter the size of a standard American destroyer. The Atlantic told a similar story, if a slower one. HMS Westcott, the ship that had trialed the Hedgehog from the start, was credited by some accounts with using it in February 1942 against U-581 off the Azores, though the historical record here is genuinely mixed. Other accounts describe that sinking as a ramming or a conventional depth charge attack, and even veterans of the ship disagreed on which weapon actually did the damage. What is not in dispute is that the Royal Navy's first confirmed Hedgehog kills did not come until November 1942, by which time the weapon had been fitted across more than 100 ships, and crews had begun to master it. By 1945, Hedgehog-armed escorts were still adding to the tally. USS Moberly used the weapon against U-853 in the closing weeks of the war in Europe, one of the last U-boats destroyed in the conflict. The numbers, once the war ended and the analysts sat down with the full record, told a stark story. Across the war, British forces made 5,174 depth charge attacks for 85.5 confirmed kills, a ratio of just over 60 attacks for every submarine sunk. The Hedgehog, over 268 recorded attacks, produced 47 kills, a ratio of roughly 5.7 attacks per kill. Put another way, a Hedgehog attack was, on average, more than 10 times as likely to sink its target as a depth charge attack. There was a further advantage that mattered enormously as the war went on, and U-boats dived deeper to escape their pursuers. Depth charges had a maximum set depth, around 600 feet for the standard American charge, while a Type 7 or Type 9 U-boat's test depth ran to 750 feet. Beneath 600 feet, a submarine was simply safe from depth charges no matter how many were dropped. The Hedgehog, striking only on contact, had no depth limit at all. The reasons for that gap were not mysterious once broken down. Contact fusing meant the weapon could only claim a kill by actually hitting the target, so its lower raw number of attacks converted far more efficiently into sinkings. Because the bombs were thrown ahead of the ship rather than dropped astern, an attacking captain kept his sonar contact unbroken through the entire run, denying the U-boat commander the blind period he had relied on to break away. And the light 65-pound charge, small as it was next to a full depth charge, did not need to be large. A single Torpex-filled bomb detonating directly against a pressure hull did more damage than a much larger charge exploding yards away in open water. Depth charges, working purely on hydrostatic shock through a cushion of seawater, lost much of their force with distance. Direct contact needed no such advantage. None of this made the Hedgehog an unambiguous improvement in every respect, and the record is honest about its limitations. A missed depth charge attack still produced a satisfying, morale-sustaining explosion, giving a crew the sense they had at least frightened or possibly damaged their quarry. A missed Hedgehog attack produced nothing but silence, which crews found genuinely discouraging even once they understood intellectually that a quiet miss was simply the weapon working as designed. The system also demanded far more of its operators. Hedgehog needed precise target information to be effective at all, and it was not until American ships began fitting combat information centers that the weapon reliably delivered on its early promise. In the interim, the shortage of well-trained crews in early 1943 meant a great many Hedgehog installations underperformed simply because nobody aboard had been properly taught to use them. The mounting itself was heavy and exposed on the foredeck, and on some destroyer classes fitting it meant giving up a forward gun turret altogether, a real loss of conventional firepower in exchange for a system that, badly handled, could fail more often than depth charges did. U-boat crews who survived a Hedgehog miss sometimes never even realized they had been attacked, which had its own operational costs. No psychological pressure was applied, no evasive maneuver forced, no contact broken off in panic the way a close depth charge pattern reliably produced. Context mattered. A poorly trained crew or a captain unwilling to trust a weapon that so often answered with silence could get less from the Hedgehog than from the blunt, reliable violence of a depth charge barrage. The verdict of the post-war navies was nonetheless unambiguous. The Royal Navy moved on to develop the Squid, a larger three-barreled mortar throwing far heavier charges on the same forward-throwing, contact-adjacent principle, which went on to record 17 kills in 50 attacks, a ratio of under 3 attacks per kill, better again than the Hedgehog it replaced. Squid was followed by Limbo, refining the concept further. The United States Navy, for its part, kept the Hedgehog in frontline service well into the Cold War, before replacing it with the RUR-5ASROC, a rocket-thrown depth charge that inherited the same core insight. Attack ahead of the ship, keep the target in unbroken sonar contact, and let the weapon do its work without warning the enemy in time to run. Every major anti-submarine mortar and rocket system built by the Western navies after 1945 descended, directly or indirectly, from the logic Jeffress's department had worked out in wartime secrecy. What that logic bought, in the end, was measured in convoys that reached harbor and submarines that never surfaced again. A weapon born from a simple observation that a depth charge could only ever attack where a submarine used to be, while a forward-thrown mortar could attack where it still was, reshaped the entire calculus of the Battle of the Atlantic, and in the hands of a single small destroyer escort in the Pacific, produced 12 days that no other warship in naval history has equaled. The Hedgehog never entirely displaced the depth charge, and it was never the effortless miracle weapon its best days made it look like. But set against 60 attacks for every depth charge kill and fewer than 6 for every Hedgehog kill, the verdict of the statistics was as blunt as the weapon itself. A bomb that only explodes when it has actually found its target will, sooner or later, find far more targets than one that explodes anyway.